For over 2,000 years, beneath the streets of a French city, ancient secrets lay hidden in the earth. Men sat in darkness, arranged in perfect symmetry, their faces turned toward the setting sun, their deaths marked by violence and mystery. Now, archaeologists have uncovered what might be the most baffling burial ground in Celtic history, and the answers they're finding are forcing us to completely rewrite everything we thought we knew about the ancient Celtic people. The year was 2024 when everything changed. In the city of Dijon, located in France's east-central Burgundy region, construction workers were preparing the grounds of the Josephine Baker Primary School for renovations. As they dug deeper into the earth, they encountered something that would transform our understanding of Celtic civilization. 13 circular pits emerged from the soil, each approximately 1 meter in diameter, arranged in perfect alignment. But what lay inside these pits would baffle archaeologists for years to come. Inside these carefully constructed graves sat the remains of 13 men, not lying down as we might expect from any burial tradition, but sitting upright. Their backs rested against the eastern walls of their pits, positioning their bodies so they faced directly westward. Their arms lay along their torsos, hands resting near the pelvis or thighs. Their legs were bent sharply and asymmetrically. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, choreographed arrangement performed with precision and ritual purpose. The French National Institute for Preventive Archaeological Research, known as INRAP, quickly mobilized. What they found was extraordinary. The deceased were all men, ranging from 40 to 60 years of age. They were tall for their time, between 5 feet 4 inches and 6 feet in height. Yet, despite their impressive stature and apparent importance, they were buried with almost nothing. No weapons accompanied them into the afterlife. No jewelry adorned their wrists or necks. No food or drink was left as sustenance for their journey beyond death. There was only silence and stone, and one single artifact. A black stone armband, worn by at least one of the buried men, dated to somewhere between the 3rd century BCE. The mystery deepened when forensic examination revealed something far more troubling. These men had not died of natural causes. Unhealed violent trauma marked their remains. Cuts scarred their upper arms. Skull fractures suggested sword blows delivered with tremendous force. These were men who had been intentionally killed, then arranged with careful deliberation in this strange and unprecedented burial ritual. The forensic evidence indicated that these injuries were sustained in life, not post-mortem inflicted on corpses. The wounds show signs of infection and bone remodeling, proving the men survived their injuries for some time before eventually succumbing to their wounds or to subsequent violence. This detail adds another layer of mystery to the burials. These were not instant deaths followed immediately by burial. These were individuals who lived with their injuries, who bore witness to their own impending deaths, and whose violent ends were somehow deemed significant enough to warrant this elaborate and unprecedented burial ceremony. The question that echoed through the archaeological community was simple yet profound. Who were these men, and why did their society choose to memorialize them in such an unusual way? Were they shamans whose spiritual power transcended death itself? Were they sacrificial victims whose deaths held ritual meaning? Were they prisoners executed as punishment? The evidence cannot yet tell us definitively. But the discovery at Dijon was only the beginning. 2 years later, in 2026, excavations expanded to an adjacent area of the school site. INRAP uncovered 5 to 6 additional seated burials, adding to the growing collection of mysteries. At least 3 of these new graves formed a second line, parallel to the first, positioned about 66 feet to the east. The pattern was consistent. The arrangement was identical. The ritual was unmistakable. This was no isolated incident or rare burial practice. This was evidence of a sustained cultural tradition, one that had been performed repeatedly over generations. By 2026, when the final excavations concluded, the site had yielded approximately 18 complete or near-complete seated burials. Each one maintained the same eastward-facing orientation. Each one showed similar signs of violent trauma. Each one contained almost no grave goods. The sheer consistency of the practice suggested something profound about Celtic society during the Late Iron Age, spanning from roughly 450 BCE to 25 BCE. This was the period when the Gauls, a loose confederation of Celtic tribes, dominated the lands that would become France. This was an age of warriors and kings, of religious ritual and political intrigue, of a civilization that was about to collide violently with the expanding Roman Empire. What makes the Dijon burials even more remarkable is how rare they are. Only about a dozen archaeological sites across all of Europe have yielded seated Iron Age burials from the La Tène period. In total, archaeologists have identified around 50 such burials worldwide. 9 are located in France, 3 in Switzerland, and the rest scattered across other regions. Most of these rare sites contain only 1 or 2 seated burials, isolated examples that provide little comparative data for interpretation. Dijon, with its 18 burials, now represents one of the clearest and most substantial clusters of this extraordinary burial practice ever discovered. The sheer concentration suggests this was not an occasional eccentricity, but a systematic practice maintained over multiple generations. Researchers have developed several theories about what these burials might represent. Some suggest these men were honored individuals, perhaps fallen warriors who received this unique burial as a mark of respect and remembrance. The careful arrangement and consistent directional orientation might indicate Celtic beliefs about the soul's posthumous journey. Others propose they might have been criminals or enemies, buried in this degrading position as a form of eternal punishment and subjugation. Still, others wonder if they were shamans, priests, or individuals linked to the political or religious sphere, their bodies positioned this way to maintain spiritual communication with the living world. The seated posture in this interpretation might represent eternal meditation or watchfulness, keeping these spiritual specialists forever vigilant over their communities. The truth is that archaeologists cannot yet say definitively. The evidence supports multiple interpretations, and until additional evidence emerges, the Dijon burials remain one of the most enigmatic discoveries in recent archaeological history. Yet their very existence tells us something crucial. Celtic. Society was far more complex, far more ritualized, and far more violent than popular imagination suggests. These were not simple warriors squabbling over pasture land. These were members of an organized civilization with sophisticated religious beliefs, with clear social hierarchies, and with carefully prescribed ritual practices for dealing with death and the afterlife. The uniformity of the burials suggests a shared cultural understanding, a collective agreement about how certain individuals should be treated in death, even when those individuals bore the marks of violence and trauma. But to truly understand what these burials reveal about Celtic civilization, we must look beyond Dijon. Across France, archaeologists have been uncovering multiple sites that collectively paint a portrait of a remarkably sophisticated ancient culture. One of the most significant discoveries comes from a necropolis excavated near the small town of Crozier-le-Neuf, located just 6 miles north of Vichy in central France. Today, Crozier-le-Neuf is a modest town of about 1,200 residents, but during the Iron Age, it occupied a position of tremendous strategic and commercial importance. The town sat at the crossroads where the territories of 3 major Celtic peoples intersected: the Arverni, the Edui, and the Biturges. This was a place of trade, of cultural exchange, and undoubtedly of political tension. The Crozier-le-Neuf necropolis dates to the Middle Latène period, spanning from the 4th century BCE to the 2nd century BCE. The site was first discovered in 2022 during preventative archaeological excavations, but the artifacts recovered there were so spectacular that they required years of painstaking conservation work before being publicly announced in 2025. What researchers uncovered there has fundamentally changed our understanding of Celtic metalworking and martial culture. Among the graves lay 2 swords still preserved in their scabbards. These were not ordinary weapons. They represent some of the finest examples of Iron Age metalwork ever discovered in Europe. The craftsmanship evident in their construction speaks to a civilization that possessed not merely functional military technology, but sophisticated artistic vision. One sword in particular stood out. When X-ray examination revealed its decoration, archaeologists gasped. The blade was ornate, covered in spirals, circles, and crescent moons. The designs were intricate and purposeful, suggesting the hand of a master craftsman. These were weapons created not merely to kill, but to display wealth, status, and artistic mastery. They were symbols of power and prestige, objects that would have marked their owner as someone of tremendous importance within Celtic society. Beyond these remarkable swords, the site yielded additional treasures. Archaeologists recovered numerous bracelets, many of which featured elaborate Celtic decorative motifs. Celtic metalworkers had a distinctive aesthetic style characterized by flowing curves, geometric patterns, and intricate knotwork. Each bracelet recovered from Crozier-le-Neuf demonstrated this mastery of design and execution. 18 fibulas, the ancient safety pins used to fasten garments, were also uncovered. These seem modest compared to the swords, yet they too tell us something important. The presence of fibulas indicates careful attention to personal adornment and clothing. These Celts were not rough barbarians living hand to mouth. They were people who took pride in their appearance, who invested time and resources in the objects they wore and carried. The Crozier-le-Neuf necropolis represents the burial ground of an elite class. These were not ordinary citizens or common warriors. These were individuals of rank and status, people whose deaths warranted burial with valuable, exquisitely crafted objects. The fact that such precious items were placed in graves, removed permanently from circulation within the living community, speaks to the importance of honoring the dead and ensuring their journey to the afterlife was accompanied by appropriate symbols of status. The investment in creating such fine weapons and ornaments, then interring them with the dead, demonstrates that Celtic societies valued the spiritual welfare of departed leaders enough to sacrifice material wealth. This practice reflects a worldview in which the afterlife held tremendous significance and in which proper burial with appropriate grave goods was considered essential to the deceased person's continued existence in the realm beyond death. But Celtic civilization was not confined to military display and burial rituals. Across east-central France, archaeologists have been excavating sanctuary sites that reveal an equally sophisticated spiritual and religious dimension to Celtic culture. One of the most important of these sites is the Sanctuary of the Sources of the Yonne, located near the Yonne River. Between 2016 and 2024, French archaeologists conducted extensive excavations at this remarkable location. What they found transformed our understanding of Celtic religious practices. The evidence suggests that around the 4th century BCE, the Celtic peoples occupying this region began deliberately demarcating sacred areas. Over time, these marked spaces evolved into substantial sanctuaries. The Sources of the Yonne sanctuary eventually encompassed multiple wooden temples, sacred enclosures, gathering areas, and ceremonial spaces. Unlike Roman temples, which were typically rectangular structures, these Celtic temples followed a distinctive design. They were square, with square inner chambers. This architectural choice appears consistent across most sanctuary temples in eastern Gaul, suggesting a shared religious architecture developed and refined over centuries. What happened at these sanctuaries provides fascinating insight into Celtic religious practice. Pilgrims and worshippers would journey to these sacred sites and leave offerings. Glass beads were deposited in the sanctuary soil. Iron farming tools, perhaps offerings from agricultural workers seeking successful harvests, were left behind. Miniature drinking cups, possibly ceremonial in nature, have been recovered. One of the most distinctive offerings was the carnix, an upright battle trumpet unique to Celtic warfare. The carnix was a symbol of military prowess and divine power. Its presence at sanctuary sites suggests these locations served not merely as places of quiet spiritual contemplation, but as ceremonial centers where the military, spiritual, and political dimensions of Celtic life intersected. The Sources of the Yonne sanctuary was particularly significant because it developed around a settlement. The site lay near springs that fed the Yonne River, suggesting that fresh water was a crucial factor in its development and ongoing importance. Yet despite the site's close association with water sources, archaeologists found no water pipes or hydraulic installations. While some Celtic sanctuaries hosted ablution rituals, ceremonies involving ritual bathing or water purification, there is no evidence that such practices took place at the Sources of the Yonne. This suggests that proximity to water was important for practical reasons, not religious ones. The springs provided drinking water for pilgrims and residents. The river enabled trade and communication with other communities. These were pragmatic considerations that shaped the location and development of this important religious center. The religious sophistication evident at these sanctuary sites extends well beyond the Sources of the Yonne. In a hilltop location called Mancy, also in eastern France, archaeologists uncovered something truly remarkable. In 2026, researchers led by Gregory Compagnon of France's Archaeological and Archaeometry Laboratory discovered a painting. This was not merely any image, but a painted representation of Sucellus, one of the principal Celtic gods. The painting survived on a masonry block that had been plastered over, preserving it for nearly 2,000 years. The painted block was discovered in a small room within one of the sanctuary's main structures. Beside the painting lay other objects that suggested this was a particularly sacred space. A small altar covered with plaster stood nearby. 2 statue bases indicated that stone sculptures of deities or important individuals once occupied this room. A large stone table and another altar with a raised edge completed the furnishings. This was clearly not a space for casual worship, but rather an inner sanctum, a holy of holies, where ritual specialists performed the most important religious ceremonies. The dating of the Mancy Temple reveals important information about Celtic religious development. The temple was constructed in the late 3rd century CE, based on a collection of 17 coins discovered on a clay floor surface and dated to approximately 280 CE. These coins were likely foundation deposits, offerings made during the temple's construction to invoke divine blessing on the new structure, but the building did not remain static. Around 325 CE, roughly 50 years. After its initial construction, the temple underwent significant remodeling. A vestibule was added at the entrance. Benches were installed for worshippers to sit during ceremonies. A podium was constructed, likely serving as a platform for a priest or religious leader to stand and conduct rituals or deliver teachings. This evidence of renovation and expansion suggests the Mancy Temple was not a forgotten backwater shrine, but an active, evolving religious center that remained important to the local Celtic population for generations. Yet religion and warfare were not the only dimensions of Celtic civilization being revealed by recent excavations. The picture that emerges from multiple sites across France is of a society far more economically complex and interconnected than historians previously understood. This complexity is nowhere more evident than at a settlement excavated in Alon, a location that was strategically situated at the intersection of several ancient trade routes. In 2026, archaeologists working at Alonnes made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the academic community. 5 pairs of iron shackles emerged from the excavation. These were not ceremonial objects or decorative items. These were brutal tools of bondage and control. Their presence at a 2,300-year-old Celtic settlement provided definitive evidence that Celtic society, like virtually every other ancient civilization, participated in slavery and the slave trade. The shackles themselves are powerful artifacts, material evidence of human suffering and bondage that occurred 2 millennia ago. But what makes the Alani site particularly important is what surrounded those shackles. The settlement itself was a hub of economic activity. Metallurgic finds recovered from the site revealed that multiple classes of metalworkers operated small workshops at this location. Blacksmiths worked with iron, creating tools and weapons. Coppersmiths worked with copper, creating decorative objects and utilitarian items. Bronze workers shaped that precious alloy into objects of prestige and power. Sheet metal workers created additional items, whose specific purposes remain subjects of scholarly debate. This concentration of different metalworking specialists in a single settlement indicates deliberate economic organization. Alans was not a random settlement that happened to have metalworkers. It was a planned production center, a place where raw materials were brought and transformed into valuable finished goods. The presence of the shackles suggests the settlement also functioned as a hub for slave trading. Enslaved individuals working at Alan may have included prisoners of war captured in conflicts with neighboring Celtic groups, convicts punished for crimes within Celtic society, or debtors who had been enslaved to work off financial obligations. Whatever their origins, these enslaved people would have provided the labor force necessary to support the extensive metalworking operations and the general functioning of such an important settlement. The economic sophistication of Alanis becomes even more apparent when considering the hundreds of coins recovered from the site. These coins were minted over a period exceeding 500 years, indicating that Alans was not briefly inhabited, but sustained economic importance across multiple centuries. This long-term occupation supports the interpretation that the settlement functioned as a permanent trade hub and production center. Coins from different Celtic peoples and even Roman coins found their way to Alonis, suggesting it operated as a meeting point for interregional trade and commerce. The variety of coin denominations and origins indicates that merchants, traders, and travelers from across the Celtic world passed through this location, conducting business and exchanging goods and information. But most intriguingly, many of these coins show evidence of deliberate modification. Approximately 1/3 of the recovered coins had been filed, sheared, or etched with a chisel. These modifications may have served various purposes. Some scholars suggest they were marks identifying the coin's owner, source, or authenticity. Others propose that filing and scraping coins was a method of checking their composition or determining their actual metal content before accepting them in trade. The systematic nature of these modifications, affecting such a large percentage of the coins, suggests an organized practice rather than random damage. The concentration of modified coins at a sanctuary-associated complex near Alans suggests a connection to religious ritual. Coins were frequently deposited as offerings at Celtic temples and sanctuaries throughout Gaul. The specific modification of these coins might represent a ritual practice, a way of preparing monetary offerings to present to the gods. Perhaps filing the coins was believed to activate or sanctify them, to transform mundane currency into sacred offerings worthy of divine attention. This tantalizing evidence hints at the intersection of religious practice and economic exchange in Celtic civilization, suggesting that the sacred and the commercial were not entirely separate realms, but were intimately connected and mutually reinforcing aspects of Celtic society. What all of these excavations collectively reveal is a Celtic civilization far more sophisticated than the popular imagination permits. For centuries, Celtic peoples have been portrayed through the lens of their conquerors. Roman writers describe them as passionate, volatile, warlike, and lacking in civilization. Medieval Christian writers incorporated Celtic mythology into their own frameworks, often distorting or misrepresenting the original beliefs. Popular culture has perpetuated stereotypes of wild-haired warriors charging into battle with careless abandon, lacking strategy, organization, or sophistication. But the archaeological evidence tells a very different story. The Celtic peoples of France during the Iron Age were organized into distinct tribal groups, each with its own territory, leadership structure, and identity. The Arverni, the Aedui, the Bituriges, and dozens of other named tribes appear in classical sources and archaeological records. Yet despite their tribal organization, these peoples engaged in regular trade, shared religious beliefs and practices, and participated in a larger Celtic cultural sphere that extended across much of Europe. The ornate weaponry found at Crozier-le-Neuf demonstrates that Celtic warriors were not merely raiders and brutes, but skilled craftsmen and individuals of refined aesthetic sensibility. The sanctuary. Sites reveal that Celtic peoples possessed sophisticated religious cosmologies and organized priesthoods capable of maintaining sacred spaces for centuries. The Allons settlement provides evidence of economic specialization, long-distance trade, and complex labor systems. Yet violence remains an undeniable part of the Celtic story revealed by these excavations. The trauma evident on the Dijon skeletons tells of a society where warfare was endemic, where death came through violence, and where the wounds of combat marked even those given elaborate burial rites. The shackles at Allons speak of a society where enslavement and forced labor were accepted practices. The Carnix battle trumpets left as offerings at sanctuaries remind us that Celtic gods were invoked not only for blessings of fertility and prosperity, but also for victory in warfare and the protection of warriors. The period during which these archaeological sites flourished was one of tremendous tension and change. The classical Greek and Roman worlds were expanding, pushing northward and eastward. The Celtic peoples of what is now France faced increasing pressure from expanding Roman power. Greek colonies dotted the Mediterranean coast. Roman merchants penetrated inland. Trade routes. By the time Julius Caesar arrived in Gaul in the 50s BCE, the days of independent Celtic civilization were numbered. Caesar's conquest of Gaul, completed by 50 BCE, marked the end of Celtic political independence in France. What followed was the gradual transformation of Celtic culture into Gallo-Roman culture, a hybrid civilization that blended Celtic and Roman gods, Celtic craftsmanship with Roman styles and technologies. This cultural transformation is visible in the archaeological record. At major Celtic sites like Bibracte, the Celtic city that served as a center of Aedui power, archaeological evidence shows a shift from purely Celtic material culture to a blend of Celtic and Roman influences. The sacred sanctuaries that had been maintained for generations gradually fell out of use or were transformed to accommodate new religious practices. The metalworking traditions that had flourished at places like Allons were adapted to produce goods suited to Roman tastes and Roman military needs. Over generations, the proud Celtic civilization that had maintained its independence and identity for centuries was absorbed into the Roman world. Yet the recent excavations remind us that this Celtic civilization deserves to be remembered not as a primitive prelude to Roman grandeur, but as a sophisticated society with its own values, its own aesthetics, and its own profound beliefs about life, death, and the sacred. The men buried in the earth at Dijon, seated upright and facing westward, remind us that cultural practices vastly different from our own can nonetheless carry profound meaning and importance. Their society believed something important enough about death and the afterlife to perform elaborate burial rituals for these men, individuals who bore the marks of violent death yet were honored with careful, deliberate arrangement in the earth. What belief system drove this practice remains unknown, but its very existence speaks to the depths of Celtic spirituality. The Crozier-le-Neuf necropolis reminds us that Celtic peoples invested enormous resources and artistic talent in creating objects of beauty and power. The ornate swords buried with the dead were not merely practical weapons, but works of art, objects that embodied their creator's vision of beauty, power, and prestige. These objects tell us that Celtic peoples valued craftsmanship, artistic expression, and the display of status and wealth. The time spent creating spirals and circles and crescent moons on sword blades was time that could have been devoted to more purely utilitarian pursuits. The fact that such effort was invested suggests that aesthetics mattered to Celtic civilization, that beauty and artistic expression were valued aspects of life and identity. The sanctuary sites remind us that Celtic peoples organized themselves around shared religious beliefs and practices. The pilgrims who journeyed to the sources of the Yonne or other sanctuary sites were part of a spiritual community. They participated in shared rituals, made offerings to shared gods, and experienced a sense of connection to something larger than themselves. The painted image of Sucellus at Mancy reveals that Celtic peoples created visual religious art, that they attempted to capture and represent their gods in material form. The provision of altars, benches, and processional routes at these sanctuaries shows deliberate planning and architectural sophistication. The settlement at Allons reminds us that Celtic economies were more sophisticated than we often credit. The concentration of metalworking specialists, the evidence of long-distance trade, the thousands of coins, and the presence of slavery all point to an economy that was complex, interconnected, and organized. People did not stumble into such systems by accident. They were created deliberately, maintained through deliberate effort, and refined over centuries of experience. The Celtic peoples understood production, trade, and commerce. They organized labor and specialized in different crafts. They participated in regional and interregional trade networks. They created systems of value and exchange. The recent French excavations have provided us with something precious, the opportunity to glimpse Celtic civilization through the physical evidence left behind, rather than through the writings of their enemies and eventual conquerors. The Dijon burials, the Creusier-le-Neuf weapons, the sanctuary sites, the Allons settlement each tell part of. The Celtic peoples of ancient France did not survive as an independent civilization. They were conquered, absorbed, and transformed. Their languages largely disappeared, replaced by Latin and the Romance languages that evolved from it. Their gods were forgotten or absorbed into new religious systems. Their political structures were superseded by Roman administration and eventually by the feudal kingdoms that emerged after Rome's fall. Yet through these recent excavations, they have found a voice again. The earth has given up its secrets, and archaeologists have learned to read those secrets, to understand what the material evidence tells us about how these ancient people lived, died, and understood their world. The French excavations continue. New sites are being discovered and explored every year. Each new find adds another piece to the puzzle, another perspective on Celtic civilization. The work is painstaking and slow, requiring years of careful excavation and conservation. But the rewards are profound. With each discovery, the Celtic people become less a shadowy legend and more a real civilization, with all the complexity, sophistication, and humanity that any society possesses. These excavations are literally rewriting history, forcing us to abandon old stereotypes and outdated assumptions, compelling us to see the Celtic peoples as they truly were, organized, talented, spiritual, and fully deserving of our respect and admiration. The secrets buried in the earth for 2,000 years continue to emerge, and they tell a story far more compelling than any legend could convey.